Judge Ethan Caldwell had developed a sharp eye for people over his years on the bench, but that morning he barely spared a glance when the teenage girl in a rumpled school uniform slipped into the courtroom. Between lawyers hustling into place and the bailiff calling out names, she looked like any shy student assigned to observe the legal process for a class project. She took a seat by the back, hugging a worn backpack against her knees. He noticed only that she was petite, with a neatly braided ponytail and wide brown eyes that flicked nervously from one person to another. At first, he assumed she was part of a group visit from the local high school, yet he realized she had come alone. The more he surveyed the scene, the more incongruous her presence felt: no teacher in sight, no other classmates. Still, it was not unheard of for an ambitious student to watch court independently. So, as the routine of arraignment started, Judge Caldwell pushed aside any curiosity about the girl and focused on the docket. Traffic offenses, petty shoplifting, a handful of minor assault charges, nothing out of the ordinary. He glanced over occasionally to see the girl scribbling notes on a small notepad, her expression intent as though trying to capture every detail. Every so often she would glance up at the judge with a steady calm that was unusual for a nervous teenager. Even across the rows of pews, he sensed something contained, almost too controlled in her posture. By mid-morning, after a short break in proceedings, he noticed the girl return to her seat, adjusting her backpack with a decisive motion, as if she was ready to continue whatever mission she had set for herself. That flicker of determination in her eyes drew his attention more than before. Curiosity gnawed at him. No typical high schooler would voluntarily spend hours studying dull misdemeanors. Why was she here? Even the bailiffs, accustomed to teenage volunteers and occasional visitors, gave the girl quizzical glances. At one point, the senior bailiff shook his head as though dismissing a puzzle he couldn't solve. Judge Caldwell paused during a lull between cases, scanning the pews. The girl kept tapping her pen against the notepad, eyes darting toward the defendants as if comparing them to something in her memory. There was a hint of tension in the curve of her shoulders. Then her gaze landed on him for a moment, direct and unflinching. The judge felt a slight jolt of surprise. He recognized an unexpected confidence in that look, the same confidence he often saw in seasoned attorneys rather than self-conscious teens. Before he could reflect on it more, the next case was called, pulling him back to the job at hand. When the midday recess finally arrived, Judge Caldwell decided he might speak with the girl, ask if she needed help or was completing a certain assignment. But as soon as the court rose, she slipped out with practiced swiftness, disappearing into the crowd. By the time he reached the corridor, scanning the bustle of lawyers and defendants, she was nowhere to be seen. It left him with a faint disquiet, a sense that this was not the last time he would see the silent schoolgirl who seemed too poised for her own disguise. He shrugged off the feeling. He had pressing matters demanding his attention, but he couldn't quite dismiss the question of who she truly was, or why she watched the courtroom with such unwavering focus. Judge Ethan Caldwell returned to the bench early the next morning, his mind still turning over the puzzle of the lone schoolgirl who had slipped away the previous day. She never gave her name, never asked a single question, yet her intense scrutiny of the court proceedings lingered in his thoughts. He glanced at the day's docket, a predictable list of minor thefts, DUIs, and a couple of preliminary hearings on small drug charges. Nothing particularly newsworthy. Yet something told him to keep an eye on the gallery. By mid-morning, as a petty burglary case dragged on with tedious witness statements, his gaze drifted over the rows of spectators. Sure enough, the same teenager sat there, wearing her faded school blouse and a navy skirt. She was scanning the participants with that same quiet focus, pen poised above her notepad. Her posture radiated an almost professional calm, especially incongruous among the handful of onlookers who stirred restlessly or whispered in bored tones. Sensing the flow of the hearing was stable, the judge signaled a brief pause in testimony, instructing the lawyers to confer with each other. Free for a moment, he used the lull to study the girl more closely. She was decidedly alone again. No teacher hovered near, no group of classmates. Instead, she seemed to discreetly tilt her head, listening with rapt attention to everything said. Periodically, she would write something down, then cross out or underline bits of text. She glanced at the bailiff's table, at the defendants, at the lawyers, as if searching for reactions or connections. When the brief recess concluded and the hearing resumed, Judge Caldwell considered how he might address the mystery. It wasn't his habit to interrogate random observers in open court, but he felt a nagging sense of responsibility. After all, Redwood High typically required permission slips for field trips, and minors generally didn't show such unwavering dedication to mundane hearings. There had to be another explanation. Not long after, the burglary matter wrapped up, and the judge moved to an arraignment for a low-level narcotics offense. As the defendant, a sullen young man, shuffled to the stand, the girl's demeanor noticeably tensed. She slid forward, hands gripping her notepad, seeming almost to hold her breath. Judge Caldwell frowned slightly. The defendant offered only routine pleas, but the girl tracked each statement as if hunting for a slip of the tongue. Did she know this defendant personally? Or was she analyzing how he responded under questioning? The judge suppressed a flicker of unease. If this was a personal vendetta, perhaps a friend or family member of a victim, he understood the curiosity. But her overall detachment and unhurried note-taking suggested something more formal, even professional. Although calling it professional for a teenager felt absurd, there was no other term for her composure. After concluding the morning session, Judge Caldwell declared a lunch recess. The gallery emptied, law clerks packed up files, and bailiffs escorted defendants away. He kept one eye on the teenage observer. She hesitated as if debating whether to leave or remain. Then, with a small sigh, she gathered her bag. Before she could slip out, he gently rapped his gavel to catch everyone's attention, specifically addressing her from the bench. "Excuse me, young lady," he said, voice measured but kindly. "Might I have a brief word with you, if you can spare it?" A ripple of surprise went through the few staff still present. The girl froze momentarily. She slowly approached the railing that separated the gallery from the well of the court, her eyes unwavering though her steps were cautious. "Yes, Your Honor," she replied softly. "Are you here for a school assignment?" He kept his tone gentle, aware he was effectively cornering her publicly. "Or do you have a personal interest in these proceedings?" She hesitated, flicking a glance at the bailiff. He nodded in neutral encouragement. Finally, she spoke, tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear. Well, it's a bit of both, sir. I'm learning about how the law deals with certain crimes. My name's Bryony." Judge Caldwell raised a brow. "Bryony. Well, Redwood High hasn't said anything about a class project that requires daily observation. Could you tell me if your teacher assigned you? Or are you just fulfilling an independent study?" She swallowed, glancing at the exit as if calculating whether she could escape. "It's more of an independent effort," she answered, her voice neither timid nor defiant, but precisely balanced. "I'm researching how the court handles certain defendants, especially those connected to bigger networks." A sense of confirmation settled in Holden's mind. Bigger networks, like a potential ring or organized group. "I see," he said calmly. "I'm all for civic engagement, but I also have a responsibility to ensure minors aren't missing classes or meddling in sensitive matters. If you'd like official permission, I can talk to Redwood High's principal or your parents." Something flickered in her eyes, alarm, perhaps. She quickly masked it, shaking her head. "That won't be necessary, Your Honor. I have it handled. Thank you for your concern." Then she dipped her head, voice faintly quivering with forced politeness. "May I go now?" He studied her, noticing the tension around her mouth, the quiet desperation that suggested she wanted to flee further questions. "Yes," he finally said, letting her leave without further demands. "But if you continue attending sessions, come see me privately. I'd like to ensure you're safe and properly authorized." She mumbled a quiet thanks and hurried out, leaving an air of unanswered questions behind her. As the doors swung closed, Holden exhaled. A few bailiffs murmured in puzzlement, collecting their gear. For the judge, the pieces were half-formed. She was gathering data about criminals who might belong to bigger networks. Something about her no-nonsense composure told him she wasn't just a frightened teen. She might be on the hunt for something. Stowing his files, Holden prepared for the afternoon docket with a heaviness in his chest. He recalled how brazen criminals sometimes used unsuspecting couriers or watchers in court to glean details about upcoming prosecutions. Yet Bryony didn't act like their puppet. If anything, she carried the air of someone hunting them. He resolved to talk to the sheriff or a trusted detective after the next session, quietly, so as not to spook the girl if her cause was legitimate. Redwood County had faced a recent uptick in drug and gang cases, many involving intimidation tactics. Could Bryony be an ally for the law, or an adversary? The possibility that she was an undercover operator, disguised as a teenager, was outlandish to consider. But the more he replayed her steady gaze, the more he felt the whisper of improbable truth. And so, as the lunch hour ended and lawyers streamed back in, Judge Caldwell braced for the next wave of routine hearings. In the back of his mind, the image of Bryony's unwavering stare lingered, fueling the suspicion that this schoolgirl might not be as naive as the rest of the world believed. He had no idea just how entangled his court would become in her hidden purpose, or how soon Redwood County would learn the shocking secret behind the quietly determined teen. Judge Ethan Caldwell spent the weekend restless, replaying his unsettling exchanges with Bryony Carlyle in his mind. He couldn't escape the feeling that the girl's presence in his courtroom was no casual affair. Her intense focus, her reluctance to explain herself, and the subtle fear beneath her polite facade all hinted at some hidden motive. Though she was clearly a teenager, she carried an adult's self-discipline and sense of urgency. Come Monday morning, Holden arrived at the courthouse early. He intended to speak with one of the sheriff's detectives, Wilson Price, a trusted law enforcement figure who often consulted with the judge about local crime trends. Holden waited in his chambers until Price arrived, his typical tie slightly askew, carrying a coffee-stained folder with daily bulletins. "Detective, I appreciate your time," Holden began, motioning Price to a chair. "I need to talk to you about a recurring visitor in my courtroom, a young girl. She says she's from Redwood High, but I have strong suspicions she's something else entirely." He filled in the detective on his observations, her daily presence, her note-taking, and her ambiguous references to bigger networks. Price sat up straighter, eyes narrowing. "Bigger networks? That's interesting. We've had an uptick in suspicious narcotics cases. Some might link to a regional gang infiltration. I wonder if this girl is investigating them for some personal reason, or if she's an unwitting pawn." His tone turned cautious. "Or, could she be an undercover agent, maybe? Though we rarely use minors for that. It's borderline if not entirely illegal unless she's actually an adult posing as a teen." The judge let that theory sink in, feeling a jolt of validation. "It crossed my mind," he admitted. "When I confronted her, she was evasive. Something about the confidence in her eyes, it just didn't match a typical high schooler." He shook his head. "But if Redwood PD had an undercover operative in that role, they'd usually alert me in some capacity, so we wouldn't compromise ongoing investigations." "True," Price agreed, flipping through a few pages of local bulletins. "We haven't been briefed on any minors embedded in Redwood High. The county is mindful of legal complexities with stings in schools. If she's an adult going undercover, that would be a state-level operation, perhaps kept extremely hush-hush." He mulled it over, scratching his chin. "Let me quietly poke around, see if anything indicates an infiltration from an outside agency. But if we find nothing, she could still be a concerned local or even a relative of a victim." Holden nodded with relief that at least someone official might help unravel the puzzle. "Thank you, Detective. And please keep this confidential. I don't want her to spook if she's working for the good guys." Price promised discretion and headed off, leaving Holden with a swirl of conflicted thoughts. He had rarely found himself entangled in behind-the-scenes espionage. Redwood County's problems usually included petty crime, not elaborate infiltration schemes. But times were changing. If criminals were pushing drugs into local schools, a covert operator might well embed themselves as a student. And if that was the case, any slip could endanger her, and compromise the system. That afternoon, Holden resumed hearing the daily docket. Sure enough, around mid-session, Bryony Carlyle sidled in, wearing the same battered uniform, hair tied in a neat ponytail. She placed herself in a corner seat this time, distanced from other visitors, scanning the attorney's table and the bailiffs as though measuring their reactions. Holden found it difficult to concentrate on the mundane larceny cases, aware that a potential operative was quietly analyzing everything. At one point, the day's schedule included a hearing about a local suspect rumored to be a low-level enforcer for an out-of-town syndicate. Bryony stiffened the moment that suspect walked in, her notepad poised with sharper interest. Holden couldn't help glancing her way, trying to read her silent tension. Her gaze flicked to him only briefly, as though acknowledging his presence but signaling that she would not speak up. If she was indeed an undercover agent, perhaps she was collecting details on how that suspect fared under cross-examination. When the hearing paused for a recess, Holden watched Bryony slip out once more, practically vanishing among the throng. He wanted to call after her, but the crowd's swirl and the press of his duties pinned him in place. Feeling a knot of frustration, he resolved to check with Detective Price later to see if any leads had emerged. As the day wound down, Holden retreated to his chambers, mentally exhausted. Court had concluded without any blow-ups, but the sense of tension hung in the air, particularly in cases tangentially tied to the rumored drug or gang rings. Defendants seemed more guarded than usual, attorneys shot anxious glances to see if any unknown watchers took interest. Holden guessed that word of the Schoolgirl observer had spread among them, leading to speculation that an informant or undercover detective might be quietly collecting intelligence. Sure enough, that suspicion was confirmed when Price reappeared near closing time. He slipped into the judge's chambers wearing a faintly perplexed expression. "I've checked official channels in Redwood PD and the county sheriff's database. None of them have someone embedded in Redwood High under the name Bryony Carlyle. However," he added, arching a brow, "I did catch a rumor from a state-level official who said they couldn't confirm or deny an infiltration op in Redwood. That's bureaucratic code for yes, but they can't talk about it." Holden leaned back in his chair, exhaling. "So my guess might be accurate, she's a state or federal plant." He pictured Bryony's unnerving composure again. "But if so, why hasn't my court been informed?" Usually, the presiding judge is at least given a heads-up to avoid inadvertently unmasking them. Price nodded. "Either they're extremely secretive about it, or she went rogue. Sometimes specialized units run these operations with minimal local coordination to prevent leaks." The detective paused, uncertain. "It's risky. If criminals suspect a student is actually a cop, her life could be in real danger. She must be collecting final pieces of intelligence for a bigger bust, or so it seems." A dark worry tugged at Holden's mind. Redwood High was a typical suburban school. The notion of an adult operative posing as a minor within its walls was far from normal. But if a sophisticated drug pipeline was grooming teenage couriers, the infiltration might be the only surefire method to gather evidence from inside. "Then we need to ensure she's not compromised in my courtroom," Holden said gravely. "If her cover is essential, I can't let staff or defendants see me treat her with suspicion. Let's keep our distance but remain alert." Price agreed, offering to post a plainclothes deputy in the public gallery discreetly whenever Bryony appeared. Holden recognized the delicate balancing act. They wanted to protect her if criminals suspected she was more than a curious teen, but also avoid letting her realize they were onto her. Her entire mission might hinge on the illusion that Redwood's local law, including the presiding judge, was clueless. That night, as Halden locked his chambers, he couldn't shake the mental image of Bryony's unwavering notepad, the steady gaze behind her teenage mask. He'd never encountered such a cunning infiltration in his quiet county. If some hidden group was powerful enough to warrant a state-level undercover infiltration, Redwood was in deeper trouble than he thought. And if everything about Bryony was choreographed to expose those criminals, a single misstep, like one guard noticing her real ID or letting slip a rumor, could blow her cover and risk catastrophic consequences. He left the courthouse with a renewed sense of vigilance, scanning the parking lot for any sign of suspicious watchers. The golden light of dusk bathed the cypress trees around the building, ironically serene in a moment brimming with tension. As he drove home, he mentally drafted a plan. He would maintain normalcy in the courtroom, proceed with standard dockets, and quietly rely on Detective Price to track behind the scenes. If indeed Bryony was an undercover operator, they'd do their part to keep her safe until her mission concluded. He only hoped Redwood's criminals didn't sniff her out first. Judge Ethan Caldwell arrived at the courthouse early Tuesday morning, heart thumping with an uncharacteristic tension. Though his daily docket remained routine, he couldn't shake the nagging awareness that beneath the veneer of traffic tickets and petty theft lay the silent drama of an undercover operation. Detective Price had promised to station a discreet deputy in the gallery whenever Bryony Carlyle appeared, but there was no telling how easily criminals might sense a trap. As Halden settled in at the bench, the first few cases breezed through: a public intoxication plea, a minor vandalism sentencing, a hearing over a fender bender. Mundane business. Yet, not long into the proceedings, he noticed the hush that always preceded Bryony's arrival. There she was again, same battered Redwood High uniform, same quiet posture, notepad perched on her knees. A plainclothes deputy lingered a few rows behind her, feigning casual disinterest. Though the courtroom bustled, Halden tracked subtle cues. He saw Bryony occasionally flick her gaze to the corners of the room where suspect watchers might loiter. She exhibited an attentiveness well beyond an average teen, scanning the back doors, double-checking each attorney who stepped forward to present arguments. At times, her eyes lingered on the day's list of defendants, as if verifying whether any connected to the ring she was investigating. He forced himself to maintain the usual impartial facade, calling each case calmly, never betraying that he suspected her true identity. Near mid-morning, a case about alleged drug distribution came up, 2 young defendants from Redwood High's vicinity. Rumors hinted they worked for a bigger operation, though the evidence was incomplete. As the hearing began, Bryony stiffened, her pen froze midair. The prosecuting attorney outlined the suspicions linking these teens to an older network. Meanwhile, the defense hammered the idea that the kids were just messing around, no real gangster connections. Halden observed Bryony from the corner of his eye. She didn't take frantic notes this time. Her gaze flitted to the defendants, trying to read their expressions. She seemed to be cross-referencing them with her mental library. A slight frown crinkled her brow when the lead defendant answered the judge's questions. Halden suspected she recognized something in that defendant's posture or words, maybe a subtle sign of loyalty to a hidden figure. Once the hearing concluded with the judge scheduling a more formal proceeding, Halden declared a brief recess. As staff bustled, he saw Bryony slip into the hallway. Quickly, Detective Price's plainclothes deputy followed, wearing the guise of a curious bystander. Halden considered summoning Bryony to his bench for a private chat, but he restrained himself. Any direct approach risked exposing her further. Instead, he let the recess run as usual, presiding over small administrative matters. When the recess ended, Halden reconvened court. The rest of the docket was routine again: traffic fines, community service updates, some repeated low-level offenders. The teen watchers, including Bryony, sat through it in a haze of near boredom, except for the occasional note scribble when a name of interest popped up. Halden caught glimpses of her exchanging nods with the deputy behind her, presumably to confirm something. By early afternoon, the day's public hearings wound down. Feeling uneasy, Halden decided to retire to his chambers briefly before returning to sign orders. As he navigated the corridor, he heard a commotion near one of the side exits, a brief raised voice, then a tense hush. His heart lurched. Could Bryony be in trouble? Hurrying closer, he saw none other than the teenage student, pressed against the wall by a wiry, rough-looking man in street clothes. The man's voice was low and urgent, but Halden caught snatches of words like, "Who sent you?" and, "You think I don't see you watching?" Another voice, Detective Price's deputy, barked for the man to step away. Before Halden could intervene, the deputy lunged in, grabbing the man's arm and yanking him back. Bryony stood there, chest heaving, notepad clutched in one hand like a makeshift shield. The man cursed, eyes wild, but the deputy pinned him to the wall with practiced efficiency. Within moments, uniformed bailiffs rushed over, subduing the intruder. Halden found his own pulse hammering. This was no minor scuffle, it confirmed that suspicious characters were actively monitoring Bryony's presence. She remained silent, rallying her composure, though a tremor ran through her shoulders. Detective Price himself arrived soon after, stepping in to question the man. He flashed a detective's badge and escorted the suspect away under guard, presumably to the station for interrogation. Halden approached Bryony with caution, ignoring the swirl of bystanders. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. "He didn't hurt you?" She exhaled a shaky breath, mustering a faint half-smile. "I'm fine, Your Honor. Just a bit shaken. He was one of the small-time watchers we've suspected, probably sent to confirm if I was a cop." She quickly checked her arms, no visible bruises. Her composure returned swiftly, the same controlled calm she displayed in the courtroom. "That was too close," Halden murmured. "You can't roam these halls alone with them suspecting you. We have to do more to protect you." Bryony shook her head resolutely. "It's almost done. My superiors are preparing the final sting. Once we gather enough intel from the next hearing or two, we can blow the entire ring open. But yes, some extra caution wouldn't hurt." He nodded, half in alarm, half in admiration. "Let me speak to the bailiffs. I'll ensure you're escorted whenever you're here. I trust this incident will accelerate your operations and—" She forced a wry smile. "I'm sure it will. They'll want me out soon to keep me safe, but we need that last thread of evidence to tie the big players. Another few days, I'd guess, then Redwood High can return to normal. I'm sorry to cause you trouble in your courthouse." Halden's eyes flicked to the spot where the scuffle occurred. "You're not the troublemaker," he said gently. "I worry for your safety. Let's coordinate better. Next time you're coming, tell Detective Price so the bailiffs can remain on alert." She agreed, pressing her lips together in a show of resolve. As uniformed officers shuffled the arrested man away, Bryony gathered her backpack. "I'll do that, Your Honor." "Thank you." Then she vanished, blending into the hallway crowd. Halden stood there, the tension in his muscles refusing to ebb. The real risk to her had finally bared its teeth, an assault mere steps from the courtroom door. The staff who witnessed it now buzzed with rumors. Was that girl threatened? Why would some thug confront her? Meanwhile, the legitimate fear that criminals suspected an undercover had just grown teeth. In the hours after the incident, Halden conferred with Addison, the administrative head, and Price's deputy, agreeing to quietly station an extra guard whenever the day's docket involved potential gang associates. He also insisted on an official statement from Redwood PD or the state task force acknowledging the presence of an undercover agent, so he might coordinate discreetly. But the detective's response was typically cryptic: "We're finalizing the operation soon. Just keep your eyes open." That evening, after the day's final gavel fell, Halden lingered alone in his chambers, replaying the scene. He recalled the flash of alarm in Bryony's eyes when pinned by that enforcer. She hid her fear well, but it was there. He realized just how courageous or desperate one must be to pose as a high school student in an infiltration. A heavy sense of responsibility weighed on him. He was Redwood's presiding judge, the legal figure these criminals might see as an obstacle. If they discovered or confirmed that Bryony was an undercover, they could lash out. He only prayed her mission would wrap before more violence erupted. He left the building under the orange glow of a late summer sunset, the quiet hum of traffic blending with the chorus of crickets along Redwood's Main Street. Tension lingered like a taut wire in his mind. One piece of good news: if criminals were rattled enough to confront her openly, perhaps they were teetering on the edge, about to be toppled by the final evidence she gathered. Still, Holden dreaded the possibility of further showdowns in his hallowed courtroom, where he was sworn to protect justice, not witness bloodshed. As he drove home, the image of Bryony's steady eyes and unwavering sense of duty burned in his thoughts. He resolved that, come what may, the courthouse staff would not let her stand unprotected. She had taken on a mission to uproot crime from Redwood's heart, and though her methods were unorthodox, her purpose resonated with everything the law stood for. Judge Ethan Caldwell arrived the next morning with a tight knot of unease in his chest. After the confrontation in the hallway, he worried that criminals might escalate their intimidation. He briefed his bailiffs and a couple of plainclothes deputies, instructing them to keep a discreet but watchful eye on Bryony Carlyle if she reappeared. Officially, they were simply monitoring potential disturbances in the public gallery. Unofficially, they knew to protect the undercover student at all costs. The docket for the day looked like a mixed bag, with a few family law disputes, small claims, and 2 preliminary hearings for drug-related offenses. None of the cases overtly connected to the ring Bryony was investigating, at least not on paper, but Redwood County's criminals had ways of appearing in tangential matters. Judge Caldwell maintained a calm facade as he took the bench, calling the courtroom to order. The usual rustle of lawyers flipping through notes and defendants shifting anxiously in pews filled the air. An hour passed with relatively mundane proceedings. Then, during a lull, he noticed a familiar presence slip into the back row: Bryony Carlyle, uniform as rumpled as ever, notepad in hand. She paused in the doorway for a moment, scanning the room like someone double-checking potential threats. Satisfied, she quietly moved to her preferred seat along the back wall. Immediately, Holden spotted one of the assigned deputies, his gaze following her from a short distance away. She didn't make eye contact, likely to avoid revealing her watchers. Holden tried to focus on the next case, a property dispute between neighbors. But he couldn't ignore the tension in Bryony's posture, the way she occasionally glanced at the side entrances. He suspected she was waiting for a particular defendant or an informant to appear. If her cover had been partially exposed to a suspicious enforcer, she might be risking a final confrontation to gather evidence. The question was, what crucial detail was she still missing? Shortly after midday, the courtroom door opened, revealing a wiry man named Tristan Vega, who had been due for a hearing on a petty theft charge. However, rumors linked him to bigger fish in Redwood's underworld. Holden noticed Bryony's eyes narrow, her hand gripping the pen more firmly. As Vega approached the defense table, he cast a quick look around, perhaps searching for that student who'd haunted these sessions. For a second, the judge thought he saw Vega's gaze linger on Bryony. Then the man faced forward, posture guarded. The hearing proceeded in typical fashion. Vega's attorney requested more time to review evidence, complaining about a backlog. But Vega himself seemed jumpy. At one point, he turned around to scan the gallery again, and Bryony lowered her head just in time, feigning interest in her notes. Holden's heartbeat quickened. If Vega recognized her, this could end badly. For now, the matter concluded with a simple continuance. Holden declared a short recess, letting people shuffle around. Bryony remained planted in her seat, though the tension in her shoulders visibly coiled. The deputy in plain clothes sidled a bit closer, posture casual but alert. Holden debated calling Bryony to a private talk in his chambers, just to see if she'd gleaned something urgent. But any open communication risked drawing suspicious eyes. Returning from recess, the court tackled smaller issues, traffic citations, a public nuisance charge. Holden noticed Bryony scanning the dais, the bailiffs, the lawyers, as though memorizing faces. He guessed she was verifying how each staff member responded to the presence of potential criminals. Or maybe she was double-checking if any were on the take. Redwood County had never been immune to corruption, though Holden liked to believe it was minimal. As the day wound down, he saw Bryony slip out again at final adjournment. The deputy followed, ensuring she wasn't cornered. Holden repressed a sigh, stepping into his chambers once more. Was this tense cat-and-mouse dynamic near its climax? He wondered. She had gleaned enough intel, presumably. So what final impetus kept her returning? He found himself flipping through the day's transcripts in search of clues. Perhaps one detail in the statements could tie directly to a higher-level conspiracy. She might be waiting for a particular person or document that hadn't yet come before the court. He was still mulling possibilities when Addison, the courthouse administrator, knocked, stepping in with a concerned expression. "Your Honor, I've had staff mention that the schoolgirl asked them pointed questions about scheduling, especially around any sealed indictments. They weren't sure how to answer." Addison looked uneasy. "I told them to simply say we can't disclose sealed matters. But it's making them nervous. They don't want to defy a judge's potential instructions, but they sense something bigger at play." Holden pursed his lips. "Thank you, Ms. Addison. It's best they not reveal sealed indictments to anyone. If Bryony is indeed an operative, she should get that info through official channels, not front desk staff. But it underscores how precarious this infiltration is. I only hope she's close to concluding." Addison shifted the papers in her arms. "We're also seeing an uptick in battered old men or skittish women dropping by, asking if certain names have upcoming hearings. Could be nothing, but it might be an organized attempt to glean data." She paused, concern clouding her gaze. "Should we escalate security further?" Holden debated. "We have that deputy assigned. Let's add a second if possible, quietly. I don't want the criminals spooked into fleeing or harming her. But we must ensure no one ambushes her again." Addison nodded, departing to arrange more coverage. Alone, Holden leaned back in his chair. The events of the past 2 weeks weighed heavily, a supposed teen quietly unmasking Redwood's underbelly, a near attack in the hallway, staff gossip swirling. He kept returning to the same conviction: the law had to protect not only the public but also those who bravely sought out evidence of crime. Whatever her real name or age, Bryony, or Officer Carlyle, as he sometimes thought of her, was risking everything to gather enough proof to topple Redwood's hidden networks. If she succeeded, the county might root out a wave of trafficking and intimidation once and for all. Despite the tension, Holden felt a flicker of optimism. Day by day, the criminals grew more unsettled, meaning the infiltration was working. The final steps were near. He just hoped Redwood County's courthouse wouldn't become a battleground. For now, all he could do was maintain normalcy in front of staff, treat the infiltration with quiet acceptance, and pray that in the end, justice, though tested, would prevail. As he packed his files that evening, setting aside the next day's docket, he pictured Bryony's steady eyes once more. For a fleeting moment, he imagined how relentless she must be, pretending to be a timid student by day, yet studying criminals in the courthouse as an expert by night. He'd never seen such composure in an adult officer, let alone a disguised youth. The final stage, he guessed, was nearing. Redwood's criminals might lash out again, or they might realize the game was lost. Either way, Holden resolved to stand firm. If the infiltration's success hinged on Redwood's courthouse supporting it, then he would do his part to ensure that no matter the threat, justice would not be driven away by fear. Judge Ethan Caldwell arrived at Redwood County Courthouse earlier than usual the next day, his thoughts consumed with the precarious game unfolding around them. Over the past weeks, the self-proclaimed Bryony Carlyle had come and gone, quietly observing cases tied to narcotics and gang activity. Security had been discreetly tightened, but tension hung like a storm cloud above the marble corridors. At any moment, criminals might lash out, and Bryony herself risked exposure every time she slipped into that battered school uniform. By mid-morning, the day's docket moved swiftly. A few traffic violations, a domestic case or two. Nothing that suggested a direct link to Redwood's underworld. Detective Price dropped by at one point, giving the judge a minimal update. No major breakthroughs, but we suspect one final piece of evidence is needed, some connecting thread to the ring's top figures. Holden nodded grimly, guessing that Bryony's infiltration must be nearing a climax. Near noon, as Holden glanced from the bench, there she was again, Bryony, quietly taking a seat in the back row. She wore her usual uniform, though it appeared more worn than ever, an uncomfortable reminder that she was far from the typical Redwood High teenager. The plainclothes deputy lingered a few rows behind, scanning for threats. Tension vibrated in the air. Then, a surprise. A hearing popped onto the docket at the last minute, an emergency motion regarding a defendant named Carlos Saldana, an alleged mid-level operative in Redwood's suspected narcotics pipeline. Saldana's lawyer claimed to have discovered new evidence that might demand immediate review, or so the clerk's notes said. Holden frowned, suspecting a tactic to glean more information about the case's direction. The sudden hearing could be a smokescreen or a chance for Saldana to suss out whether the court was compromised by informants. Holden instructed the bailiff to call the case. Saldana, a wiry man in his late 20s, entered in cuffs, flanked by two uniformed deputies. His face betrayed careful composure. He stood before the bench, arms tense. His attorney rattled off some argument about irregularities in the search warrant. Holden listened politely, though his eyes occasionally flicked to the gallery, where Bryony's posture had gone rigid, pen at the ready. She seemed braced for a confrontation. Sure enough, mid-argument, Saldana cast a long, penetrating stare at the pews. Holden sensed he was searching for someone, perhaps the rumored schoolgirl who had garnered suspicion among his associates. Bryony kept her head bowed. But Saldana's stare found her anyway. A flicker of recognition, or maybe just suspicion, curled his lip. His attorney paused, glancing at his client, apparently confused by the sudden tension. Holden maintained a neutral expression. He tapped his gavel softly to regain order. "Let's keep this about the motion at hand, counsel," he said, trying to divert Saldana's attention. The defendant slowly exhaled, turning back to face the bench, but the roiling air suggested the moment was far from over. Saldana's lawyer finished his spiel, requesting that certain evidence be sealed or suppressed. Holden, unimpressed by the weak argument, denied the motion, scheduling a formal hearing later. The scowl on Saldana's face deepened, but he had no choice but to accept the ruling. The bailiff began leading him away, when suddenly, Saldana spun, locking eyes with Bryony. A hush seized the courtroom. Holden's heart pounded. The bailiffs tensed, ready to intervene, expecting Saldana might launch into a threat. But the man only shot her an icy glare. You're not who you pretend to be," he snarled low, words hissing through the hush. A few spectators gasped. A bailiff barked for Saldana to face forward. Bryony didn't flinch, her expression calm, though Holden recognized the slightest tremor in her hand clutching the pen. The bailiffs hustled Saldana out the side door, his curses echoing down the hallway. Judge Caldwell declared a recess. People milled around in a swirl of hushed excitement. The tension had soared dangerously high. Bryony remained in her seat, capturing scattered notes with trembling pen strokes. Holden realized this might be her last moment of real anonymity. The criminals had effectively called her out. If Saldana recognized her, the entire infiltration might collapse. He signaled to the plainclothes deputy, who nodded in understanding. When the courtroom emptied, the deputy approached Bryony, speaking in low tones. Though Holden couldn't hear every word, he sensed from her stiff posture that a crucial decision was being made. She nodded once, stuffing her notepad into the battered backpack. The deputy gestured for her to follow him out a staff-only exit, presumably to ensure she didn't walk into an ambush. Holden watched them go, a pulse of anxiety throbbing in his chest. If Saldana had truly pinned her as an undercover agent, Redwood's criminals might scramble to silence or discredit her at any cost. 15 minutes later, Addison knocked on the judge's chamber door, breathless. "Your Honor, that girl, she left with the deputy, but Saldana's associates were spotted near the parking lot. The bailiff stepped in, and I think they're escorting her to a safe location. It's all happening so fast. Are we at risk of a bigger scene?" Holden considered the swirling possibilities. If Saldana's gang was brazen enough to challenge her in broad daylight, a violent confrontation might erupt. "We must keep a tight watch on every exit. If they come inside, we'll lock down the courthouse," he replied, taking Addison's worried expression as confirmation. Redwood had never needed a lockdown before, but there was always a first time. Outside, thunder rumbled, a storm approaching, an apt reflection of the turmoil unfolding. Through his office window, Holden caught a glimpse of the swirling dark clouds. He prayed that Bryony had a strong enough police escort to reach safety. He also dreaded that if the criminals wanted to retaliate, Redwood's courthouse might become a battleground. Still, there was no choice but to press on, trusting the law's protective measures. Resuming court after the unscheduled break, Holden forced himself to address the next set of cases with his usual composure. Yet, behind his calm announcements, he kept thinking, is she safe? A few staff meandered in and out, whispering about the near confrontation. The day's routine felt overshadowed by the knowledge that Redwood's seedy underbelly had begun to push back, edging closer to open violence. Late that afternoon, with the docket complete, Holden lingered in the hallway, scanning for any sign of the plainclothes deputy or Bryony. He spotted Detective Price stepping briskly from an elevator, wearing a grim expression. Price approached, lowering his voice to a near whisper, "We got her out, Your Honor. She's under protective watch now. The suspect's associates retreated when they saw we had more men. But I suspect it's reaching the end. The sting operation is culminating, she likely has enough evidence." Relief warred with lingering tension in Holden's chest. Thank goodness. But if Saldana recognized her, they might accelerate any plan to neutralize her. "Are we certain we can keep her identity guarded?" Price nodded. "We're fairly certain. We have a safe house lined up. She won't return to Redwood High or your courtroom again unless absolutely necessary. She believes she's gathered enough to tie the ring's local branch directly to the bigger syndicate. That's the final piece she needed." Holden exhaled a long breath, the weight in his shoulders easing. "So, she might not appear here anymore. I suppose that's best for her safety." He paused, letting a pang of regret surface. He'd come to respect her fierce courage. "Let's hope it all ends without further bloodshed." Price offered a cautious nod, "We'll move swiftly. The DA's office is coordinating with the state, planning arrests of the higher-ups. Saldana's people are spooked, which ironically means we might have them cornered." Watching Price stride off to orchestrate the next step, Holden sank into a quiet acceptance. If Bryony's infiltration had ended, Redwood might soon see the criminals indicted, the infiltration revealed. In that scenario, the courthouse could breathe easier, no longer overshadowed by secrecy. But it also meant Redwood had come dangerously close to a violent showdown. He felt gratitude that the final confrontation didn't unfold in his courtroom or the hallway again. Later, as the sun dipped, Holden left the courthouse under a bruised purple sky. The day's tension still rippled in the air, but he found comfort in the notion that Bryony, a fearless operator disguised in a battered school uniform, was now under police protection, awaiting the final bust that would dismantle Redwood's criminal network. If fortune favored them, Redwood County would soon wake to news of a sweeping sting, criminals in handcuffs, and the extraordinary story of how a schoolgirl had quietly paved the path for justice. Driving home, Holden allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. He had done his part, providing a stable courtroom environment for the infiltration. Now, with the end in sight, Redwood County could hopefully reclaim a sense of safety. Yet he reminded himself that criminals rarely went down easily, and that before the story fully closed, there might still be sparks of danger. Nevertheless, he clung to hope that the new day approaching would see Redwood free of the poison that threatened its youth, and Bryony, once an invisible presence in the back row, at last stepping out of the shadows to claim her well-earned victory. Judge Ethan Caldwell spent a sleepless night turning over every possibility in his mind. With Bryony now under police protection, the covert operation that had long lingered on the fringes of his courtroom seemed to be reaching its final stage. He rose early the next morning, bleary-eyed but resolute, determined to keep the courthouse running smoothly while beneath the surface, a massive sting operation loomed. If all went well, Redwood County might soon see the criminal ring dismantled. If things went awry, violence could erupt at any moment. Arriving just before the doors opened, he found Detective Price waiting in his chambers with an urgent update. The detective looked tired but focused, flipping through notes detailing the ring's hierarchy. Price explained that Bryony, who was now safely stashed away at an undisclosed location, had passed on a wealth of evidence linking the local suspects to a broader network across county lines. This included names, coded references, meeting spots, and hints at deeper corruption. The plan was for a coordinated takedown over the next day or two, with arrest warrants to be served in one sweeping motion. Price warned that a cornered syndicate could lash out in desperation. Holden thanked him, feeling both relief and anxiety. He recalled the tension in the hallway when one suspect had tried to confront her. "What do you need from me?" he asked quietly. Price requested that the judge remain vigilant. Some of the indicted might try to disrupt court proceedings if they realized the net was closing. Holden nodded, promising to keep staff on high alert, discreetly. He didn't want a courthouse locked down unless absolutely necessary, for fear it would tip off the criminals that something big was coming. That day's docket contained an unusual set of motions, including last-minute pleas from multiple defendants known for borderline gang affiliations. It was as though they sensed trouble and were rushing to secure deals or bail before the sting hammered down. Holden sat through the morning session calmly, each hour reinforcing his belief that Redwood's criminals were scrambling for any advantage. They might suspect an informant, but they didn't fully grasp that she was the quiet schoolgirl who'd vanished from the gallery. Shortly before noon, Ms. Addison approached the judge during a break, handing him a sealed envelope marked "Urgent, DA's office." Opening it revealed a private request for an emergency hearing the following afternoon regarding a major new indictment. The letter hinted that Redwood's court would host the initial appearance for a top suspect. Holden recognized the significance. The DA intended to bring in one of the highest-ranking local ringleaders, presumably the linchpin of the entire operation. This was it, the moment Bryony's infiltration had been building toward. The hearing, if it took place, would blow the lid off Redwood's hidden criminal underbelly. Holden felt a surge of worry, picturing crowds of reporters and the possibility of armed associates trying to rescue or silence the indicted figure. Redwood's courthouse would be the epicenter of a legal earthquake. He turned to Addison, instructing her to coordinate with law enforcement for enhanced security and to keep the staff calm yet prepared. She nodded solemnly, acknowledging the gravity. That afternoon, a hush of anticipation settled over the corridors as word quietly leaked of a major suspect's imminent capture. Bailiffs exchanged uneasy glances. Clerks dashed about finalizing the next day's schedule. Holden caught a glimpse of Detective Price outside conferring with uniformed deputies, likely hashing out how to transport a dangerous defendant without risking a shootout. The building's tension felt almost tangible, like the air just before a storm. In the midst of this subdued chaos, Holden couldn't help thinking about Bryony. He wondered if she was somewhere safe, anxiously awaiting the operation's outcome. He almost wished she could see the final blow to the criminals who had preyed on unsuspecting students, threatened her life, and tried to manipulate Redwood's justice system. Yet it was best she stayed hidden until the sting concluded. Her presence at the courthouse now could spark a desperate bid for revenge from the indicted men. Evening approached, and Holden lingered once more in his chambers, double-checking the next day's docket. It showed the cryptic State vs. Jonathan Dumas, indicted on multiple counts, scheduled for a 2 p.m. initial hearing. He'd heard rumors that Dumas was a mid-tier figure with ties that stretched to a statewide syndicate. If the DA had enough evidence, they might coerce him to flip on even bigger fish. This might explain why Bryony's infiltration was so crucial, gleaning the last threads to link Dumas's cell to the ring's leadership. Holden's pulse quickened. If Redwood's criminals realized how close they were to collapse, would they attempt something desperate overnight? As he left the nearly empty courthouse at dusk, Addison walked with him. She voiced the staff's growing anxiety about potential violence the next day. Holden reassured her they'd do everything possible to keep the building secure, multiple bailiffs on every floor, an undisclosed route for transporting the defendant, and a strict check of all visitors. Addison took notes, promising to see it through. The swirl of looming excitement mingled with dread weighed on both of them. Driving home under a fiery sunset sky, Holden tried to steel himself for the pivotal hearing that lay ahead. If Detective Price's intelligence was correct, Redwood County would see the ring's downfall. All thanks, ironically, to an undercover schoolgirl whose unwavering nerve had delivered the final puzzle pieces. He couldn't help picturing her calm stare, the battered uniform that once seemed so incongruous. Now, it made sense. Her entire existence in Redwood had been a carefully crafted ruse, culminating in tomorrow's big play. He spent a restless evening at his kitchen table, reviewing case notes and sipping lukewarm tea. The possibility of an armed confrontation weighed on his mind. He'd never had to orchestrate such high security for a single hearing. Yet Redwood deserved the chance to eradicate this criminal plague. If they succeeded, the local high school would be safer, and a wave of intimidation tactics would be curtailed. Late that night, as he tried to settle into bed, Holden silently hoped that by the time tomorrow's hearing ended, Redwood County's toughest criminals would be behind bars, and that Bryony, wherever she was, would find closure. For despite the unorthodox methods and the peril she endured, she had reminded him why the justice system needed fresh eyes and fearless hearts. Now, if only all that risk truly paid off and Redwood stepped into a safer dawn, her sacrifice would not be in vain. Judge Ethan Caldwell stepped into courtroom one early that afternoon with his heart thrumming under a veneer of judicial calm. The day's main event had been whispered about all morning, the initial hearing for Jonathan Dumas, a key figure indicted for orchestrating Redwood County's narcotics network. Holden had never seen security so tight in this modest courthouse. Uniformed deputies stood at every door, bailiffs scanned each arriving visitor, and Detective Price's team hovered inconspicuously in the gallery's corners, prepared for any disruption. When court convened at exactly 2 o'clock, the atmosphere was electric. Dumas was led in wearing shackles, flanked by serious-faced deputies. He was a wiry man with cold eyes and a sneering composure, the kind of criminal who exuded confidence that he could somehow slip the system's grasp. Clusters of local reporters lined the rear pews, eager to snap a sensational photo of the rumored drug kingpin of Redwood. If the rumors were true, he represented the top rung of a syndicate that had sown fear among students and families alike. Holden took his seat at the bench, rapped his gavel, and called the hearing to order. He introduced Dumas's case number and set out the formalities, speaking in that measured timbre that had steadied countless nervous defendants. But he, too, felt the tension. Was Dumas aware that an undercover operative had fed the DA enough evidence to secure this indictment? Would he lash out in some final attempt at intimidation? Before Dumas could utter more than a few words, the prosecuting attorney rose and laid out the government's case: multiple charges of racketeering, narcotics distribution, intimidation, and organized crime. The attorney cited unassailable testimony from a key eyewitness, further supported by data gleaned through infiltration at Redwood High. At that, Dumas's sneer faltered. A hush fell as everyone realized they were referencing Bryony's intelligence. Whispers spread among the spectators. Could Redwood's mysterious teenage observer truly have been at the heart of this entire operation? Dumas muttered angrily to his lawyer, who tried to maintain professional composure. The judge, noticing the suspect's agitation, insisted on decorum. "Mr. Dumas, you'll have your turn to speak. For now, we'll let the prosecution outline the basis for these charges." The man glowered but complied, though his eyes roamed the gallery as if searching for someone to blame. After the initial recitation of charges, the defense demanded to know more about the infiltration. "Isn't this entrapment?" the defense counsel barked, voice echoing off the paneled walls. "My client had no fair warning that a covert agent was feeding partial truths," a bailiff rapped on the bench, reminding him to address the court respectfully. Holden calmly noted that any questions regarding the undercover operation's legality would be handled in subsequent hearings, and that for an initial appearance, the question was whether sufficient probable cause existed to hold the defendant. The state assured him they had more than enough. The hearing took nearly an hour of back-and-forth arguments. Dumas's attorney tried to sow doubt about the infiltration's evidence chain, but the prosecution maintained that Redwood PD, with state assistance, had meticulously documented each step. At certain points, the name, Bryony Carlyle, hovered on the edge of conversation, but the attorneys referred only to an undercover officer disguised in Redwood High. They avoided specifics, likely to protect her identity from any lingering associates of Dumas. As the hearing neared its end, the tension reached a fever pitch when Dumas, apparently deciding subtlety no longer served him, leaned forward and snarled at the prosecutors. "This entire case is built on lies from that little spy." The bailiffs tensed, stepping closer. Dumas jerked his head around, scanning for the girl he suspected had orchestrated his downfall. Seeing no sign of her, he let out a derisive laugh. "Coward," he spat, presumably into the silence, "thinks she can hide forever?" Holden rapped his gavel, raising his voice. "Mr. Dumas, you will respect this court. Another outburst, and I'll hold you in contempt." Dumas fell silent, though an undercurrent of fury burned in his eyes. If any doubt remained that the criminals had discovered Bryony's role, it was gone now. They blamed her for this entire unraveling, and they wanted vengeance. Finally, Holden reviewed the prosecution's statements and concluded, probable cause was clearly established. Bail was denied, given the gravity of the charges and the risk of flight or harm to witnesses. Dumas was to remain in custody, and a formal trial date would be set. The judge's words sealed the hearing's outcome. A hush spread in the gallery, a sense that Redwood County had reached a turning point. The crowd parted in tense silence as bailiffs led Dumas away, his vitriolic muttering echoing off the walls. After the hearing, Holden stepped back into his chambers with Addison trailing behind. She was visibly relieved. "We did it," she breathed. "No outbreak of violence, no last-second sabotage. The suspect is in custody." Holden nodded, only then noticing the tension in his own shoulders. Yes, Redwood's worst criminal ring might finally be broken. "At least at the local level," he said. "But let's not forget, the trial hasn't even begun. We have to ensure the entire chain of evidence stands up in court." Addison gave him a grateful smile. "You did well, Your Honor. You balanced the hearing with caution and fairness, even with so much at stake." Sometime later, as staff drifted out for the day, Detective Price appeared again, fatigue etched in his features. He bore news that multiple arrests had been executed across Redwood and neighboring counties, swooping in while Dumas was off the streets. The entire operation had been timed around this hearing, taking advantage of criminals who might have let their guard down. Price admitted the infiltration was complete, meaning that Schoolgirl would soon slip away to her next assignment or perhaps re-emerge as an adult detective. Holden felt a pang of regret, recalling how he never truly thanked her for the risk she took, masquerading as a vulnerable teen. "Will we see her again, to testify if needed?" he asked quietly. Price nodded. "Likely so, at the trial. Though it may be handled via sealed testimony or remote means to protect her. The DA's figuring it out. But Redwood's immediate threat is contained. That's the bigger relief." A hush of gratitude settled in Holden's chambers. Addison, standing by the door, dabbed tears from her eyes, perhaps recalling the swirl of fear that once gripped the staff. She gave a shaky laugh. So all that tension, worth it, if Redwood High can breathe easy again. Price agreed, and Halden quietly echoed the sentiment. They parted ways, each returning to the usual duties of legal administration, but the building felt changed. Word of Dumas's abrupt downfall and the cunning infiltration that had led to it spread swiftly among employees. Some staff still reeled from the revelation that the shy, Bryony Carlyle was never who she claimed, but an officer embedded in Redwood's daily life. That evening, Halden lingered alone in the now calm corridors, reflecting on the remarkable saga. He recalled how unassuming Bryony seemed at first, perched among the gallery seats, scribbling fervently. He remembered the confrontation in the hallway when a suspect cornered her. He felt relief that the final day's hearing concluded without bloodshed, and pride that Redwood's courthouse had withstood the criminal's intimidation. The infiltration had been unorthodox, but it proved vital in dismantling a ring that threatened Redwood's youth. By the time he stepped outside, dusk painted the sky in soft mauves and pinks. Addison and a few staff headed home in groups, smiling in relief as they realized Redwood might soon return to peace. Halden found himself scanning the parking lot, as though half expecting Bryony to appear in uniform one last time, notepad in hand, giving him a nod of farewell. Of course, she was gone, presumably whisked to safety or on to her next mission. In the following days, Redwood County embraced a hopeful calm. Arrests multiplied, evidence from Bryony's infiltration spurred multiple plea deals, and Redwood High saw fewer rumors of gang presence. Halden oversaw the preliminary steps to ensure a fair trial for Dumas and his associates, but the outcome looked all but certain: the criminals no longer had a stranglehold on Redwood's youth. Weeks later, Halden received a sealed letter from the state's investigative unit. Inside, a short note on official stationery thanked him for providing a stable judicial environment that allowed the infiltration success. It was signed with only initials, presumably from Bryony, who wrote, "Grateful to your court for not asking too many questions too soon. The ring is finished. Redwood is safer." He reread that note twice, letting the quiet satisfaction seep in. He recalled her unwavering stare, the battered uniform, the solitary figure among the gallery seats. He pictured her stepping away into anonymity, mission accomplished. In his mind, she would forever remain the schoolgirl who upended Redwood's criminal underbelly with unwavering courage, and reminded him of the law's ultimate purpose, not simply to punish wrongdoing, but to protect the innocent from lurking darkness. Standing at his window, Judge Ethan Caldwell watched the golden light of late afternoon wash over Redwood's Main Street, feeling the sense of a fresh chapter opened. Whether she was Tamsin, Bryony, or some other name in a half-dozen aliases, the undercover operative had left Redwood more just than she found it. He whispered a silent thanks to her, and a pledge to carry forward the spirit of vigilance she had brought, ensuring that Redwood's courts remained accessible, fair, and watchful for the sake of every person who might pass through its hallowed doors.